I've been saying for quite some time that we need to have some sort of oversight of these HR solutions, and particularly the AI HR solutions, because we need to be able to assess how the calibration of whether or not they are meeting even the basic standards of what we expect from human beings, let alone going above what we're expecting from human beings, right? Because we can make mistakes really fast with AI versus making mistakes kind of slower with employees.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome, everyone, to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. We're recording today on July 17th, 2024, bringing you all the news you can use this week. I'm your host, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group, a research and advisory firm. And joining me today is my co-host and colleague, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst for Sapient Insights Group. Welcome again to the show, Cliff. And where are we going to get started with all this tea this week? We had a lot last week. It was almost an hour's worth of content. I think we're going to try and keep it a little bit lower this week, right?
Yeah, I think so. And to a certain extent, we have a lot of news, but some of what we were selecting and talking about, I think, is related to what we talked about last week, or I should say the last recording 2 weeks ago, because there's just so much that has happened and so much as kind of this conversation keeps going. And I kind of got the sense, I think even from my own statements and, just from the stories that are out, there was a little negative, but so I was really interested, like what is really happening with the market and what are people talking about? For those of you that sort of keep track at home, we jokingly call it the Spilling the Tea on HR drinking game, drinking tea, of course. How long until we mention AI? Well, for those of you that are drinking something stronger than tea, go easy, because there's going to be a lot of AI talk, a lot of it. And we're going to jump right in, though. But let's start with some personnel moves and some of this company things that are going on. And we'll get in some really big, sort of broad moves that happened as well, and different takes on these sort of things. So I'm going to start right off with, we had some personnel movements, and this is going on. Cornerstone just hired Michael Pawlyszyn, or might be Michael Pawlyszyn. Let me know, Michael, if you're hearing this, as Executive Vice President and Chief Revenue Officer. He comes from SAP SuccessFactors most recently. And, just again, it's bringing in a lot of experience. There's a lot of interest in go-to-market strategy. And obviously, anytime you have that title, Chief Revenue Officer, I think it really does point to something that we've seen, I would say now for the last, let's just say this whole year, of really nailing where the market is going, making those sort of predictions and adapting as fast as possible.
Yeah, we've talked for quite a bit this year as we've seen Cornerstone really reinvesting in their leadership team, rethinking sort of their strategy about their go-to-market models. This is not a surprising sort of next step for them to sort of bring in someone who's got enterprise-wide experience and background. I think it just goes towards two things for them. One is their push to really go global, more so than they already have. I think, as an organization, they were probably one of the first LMSs in the market to really be more global. And they're definitely, I think, sort of thinking a little bit more broadly about their role as an HR solution, especially with that talent agility and the workforce agility conversation, and how we can sort of bring them all together through a skills model. But I also think that for them, there is a need to make sure that sort of they are doing this in a way that speaks to the audience. And, we'll get a chance to sort of get some more updates from them, hopefully in another week or two. But I think this tour that they were on, where we were part of a couple of events that we went to, really think help them understand that, the audience they're speaking to now has changed a lot. A lot of the long-standing senior leaders, both in learning and talent and HR, oftentimes have moved into new roles. We saw, as we said, about 10% of the whole market, right, had just completely flipped and gone into either retirement or new roles altogether. And so I do think, this requires some different thinking about sales. And that's a conversation I think every solution provider is having today, is I can't sell what we do today the same way I sold 2 years ago or 5 years ago, even. Things are just different. So this is, I think, an interesting news that we need to keep an eye on. We're probably going to see more of this across the board, right?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, that relates to some interesting research that came out. This is from Venero Managing Partners. And they did some research on what the HR tech space, the HR tech market as a whole looks like. And they are calling it a boom in investments. And this is specifically relating to mergers and acquisitions type activity, right? So how active is the market? And it seems like it's been a lot. And it's great to see this validated through some data. Some of the numbers that they had, there were 100 transactions just in this quarter, the second quarter of 2024. So that is the second highest quarterly volume in 2 years and up 93 from the first quarter, which is honestly, it felt very big. I think a lot of our stories in that first quarter, it seems like we saw a lot of M&A. A lot of it centered in the US. That was 47 of that 100, and then Europe with 26. So, this isn't just, one area. This is a global phenomenon. UK and Ireland specifically had 12. So, it goes to what you were just saying, right? There's definitely an interest and a knowledge that this is a growing and important market. I think a little later on, when we're talking about AI as promised, it really shows that we have some kind of interesting anecdotal evidence, but it really shows that HR is on the forefront of this technology. And there are so many different companies that are using it. And not only that, just the sort of traditional HR processes haven't gone away. You just mentioned skills, for instance. And I think that, there's just more interest and more value seen in these organizations and how they can be used to improve the value of the organization as a whole. Something I'd like to point out that you've been talking about for a while now.
Yeah, the mergers and acquisition, we started off the year saying this was going to be a year of big mergers and acquisitions. And mergers and acquisitions in any kind of industry happen a lot of times because there was a little bit of a slowdown. Some of the smaller firms can't quite sort of make the case for sort of staying standalone. But I think also, too, for the HR market, we've seen not only do we have slowdowns and upcycles and sort of just overall spending, we do see different parts of HR sort of see slowdowns and upswings, right? And so I think that's a lot of what we see here is that we saw a lot of interest in what was happening in the talent intelligence space. We saw a lot of interest in what was happening in skills management over the last year or two. We've also seen a lot of interest in benefits and wellness and mindfulness, all those kind of things. And we're seeing a lot of those things being they were sort of birthed is a good way to put it in smaller companies with more flexibility, more capability to sort of get them out the door more quickly. But now the big enterprise systems are saying, look, this could be part of our picture and be a really good part. And it's a little bit more secure for those companies. And so we're seeing sort of those pickups in the mergers and acquisition. There's also a slight uptick, I think, if you look at all the numbers. Anita, I think, put some numbers about this, and George, and I know just in sort of talking to some of the really, really small companies, we are seeing a slight uptick in like seed funding, early funding. We've had a couple of small funding things, which we weren't hearing at the first part of this year as well, which that then gives us hope that we will see some more emerging tech hit the ground again this fall. I think it kind of got a little bit light as the market slowed down a little bit. So yeah, this is it's always an interesting thing when you think about investments from a pure investment perspective, not sort of the bigger or sort of public investments, those kind of things. But you're always taking a bit of a chance or a bit of a risk when you're doing investments in new organizations. And, I think the numbers, 1 out of 10 make it in any one sort of fund, right? I think there is a real interest in the fact that HR solutions have a bit more of a built-in audience if we can find the right challenges, because it's a market that is so wide and touches so many people in the organization that many times it's not just about whether or not you have a good idea or a good product. Also, did you do your marketing well? Did you do your outreach and your sales well? And so that's an interesting place, I think, for people to do investments, because they know they can have an impact on some cases, not just in whether it was a good idea or a bad idea or was a consumer market or not, but that actually they could make a difference just by how they help the organization sort of figure out, market share and sales and things that many of the investors have experience and background in. So I think we're going to see more of that. I think the big conversation that's coming out right now, I'm getting ready to post a blog about this next week, is on private equity firms, going public, those kind of things. We have a lot of questions around that. The UKG layoffs were part of, I think, driving some of that conversation. I think everybody is asking this question: what is the role private equity firms are playing in this market? What's the role venture capitalists are playing in this market? And what's the role public companies are playing in this market? So we'll have some more details on that, I think, in another week or so. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of increased funding, there were other stories. I just wanted to kind of, sort of pick and choose, because as you said, there's a lot of kind of small ones out there. One I found interesting was a company, Work Hero. They're out of Munich. They're a startup, and they raised 4 million euro for AI-based talent matching, which I thought was pretty interesting, because I think that, we're finding maybe not better, but more broad uses of AI, something beyond the sort of headline grabbing generative text or creating images. Those are really interesting. And that's usually where you see people saying, oh, here's where it's falling apart. But there's a lot of other opportunities and use here. And as you mentioned something earlier, like finding those problems, and that's a big problem, right? As soon as come through the talent acquisition space, and even if you haven't, if you've only been on the other side of it, that sometimes you're like, how do I, it's very hard to do this in great volume, to find the right match and find these skills. Okay, we know we need these skills, and it's got to go beyond just finding the right word, but finding other ways to match up the right people with the right positions.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I noticed is, I just looking at the numbers, non-US based startups are seeing a little bit of an easier time in getting funding right now, at least at this level. I think some of that comes out of the fact that we do see more of the double-digit growth, probably from an international perspective, because the US market is highly saturated in certain areas, right, when it comes to HR technology. But I also think it's because we're looking, there's some different perspectives on talent, different perspectives on recruiting and thinking about HR that just kind of challenges the status quo. The US has led this market for many a year in thinking about talent management. I think there's some opportunity here to think about it a little bit differently, that some organizations are bringing to the forefront, and they're now getting some funding for it. So,
yeah. And one thing that also made this stand out to me is that specifically what Worker Hero does is works in the blue collar, right? So, I think, some of the ones that stood out to me that were US based that I knew a little bit more were like HelloFresh, finding those, new markets for these sort of things, rather than just the sort of traditional way that we think about that. And
we should note, though, I believe, I could be wrong on this, but I believe blue collar is more of a U.S. term.
Yes, that's true.
It's more skilled labor when we look at probably from the European market side, but just because I know I'm going to get called on that by some
Good
friends.
I'm saying labor with a U for all my European friends. There we go. Now, speaking of like different ways of thinking about AI, there was a fascinating post that you sent me, Stacey, from Off Your Block, talking about something that happened at WorkMe and the capabilities and how AI can play a part. And he described this whole journey of going from literally sort of a napkin sketch all the way to a product release video, and all the different ways AI played a part in, doing the visual design and doing the frameworks and taking all of these, things that it can help with, even the audio, which I forget because I've used audio AI tools, and said, right, there's capabilities in there for doing these sort of things and finding gaps and, removing high and low end. Sorry, just to get into the audio thing, but it's all of these that come together. And so that you're able to get an idea and quickly put it into place from making this. And the video, and we'll have the link in the show notes. And for those of you watching on YouTube, it'll be in the YouTube comments. That video is embedded in there, and he's pretty proud of it. And I think it's pretty good. I watched it. It doesn't have a lot of the hallmarks of early AI, let's say, where I'm like, this looks like someone messing with me. It makes a good point of just the capabilities there. And, and look, this isn't something where it was taking a job away from someone else, which is often when you're talking about creative things, it can be, especially in this environment with a lot of layoffs, like, is this taking someone's job? No, this was, people are working on this. It wasn't just that, hey, AI, make me this. He goes to his team and says, okay, now use the tools available to you to make this.
And I think, WalkMe is a really good example of a digital technology that has been designed with the idea of improving the human experience, not replacing the human experience. Another example of an organization that does this is Pendo, right? We'll be at Pendo's headquarters next week, actually, for our offsite, where we'll be doing a whole executive roundtable on change leadership, and particularly change leadership in the age of increasing diversity conversations inside of an organization. And that's, I think, a really, when we think about sort of how AI can be embraced inside of organizations, I think the most important thing is to think about how it works with humans, not how it replaces humans. And that's, I think that was a really good example from Oprah, which is why I wanted to sort of pull it out. I had this great, interesting conversation with my son last night. My son works in our space and he follows the gaming space very closely. I know you do as well, Cliff. And so I was asking, I was like, so if you're a role-playing person, is AI now are they getting to the point where you can have real conversations with the non-player characters, right? NPCs, as they call them for those in the market. But, because we're at a point where we can have those kind of conversations at some level with ChatGPT. And he's like, not really. That's not the big thing that's happening. His conversation is that the biggest issue was the gaming industry using artificial intelligence generated artwork for the games. And that was actually the big conversation, because that was first of all, they felt that the art was being created by people who were not getting credit for their art, because a lot of it was being scraped from the internet and the web, and a lot of there's fan art out there, which is where a lot of this comes from, and that they're not paying people to do that work, right? And so they're basically just using whatever AI generates. And I think that's I think going to be it's going to be the communities that are going to push back on some of this. It's not just going to be can it or can it not. It's going to be, are we doing this in a way that works holistically with our community, right?
Absolutely. And great segue into, I think, probably one of the bigger stories that any of our listeners, viewers might have even heard about, so much so that it was being picked up by larger ones, which is, this was from Lattice, and they had revealed a product, or, I guess released a product that would have treated AI entities within an organization within a sort of org chart, saying like these are people. So it's treating the AI chatbots or instances where I would say it's more likely they were agents at that point, but I don't want to split hairs, and treating them as people within an organization afforded some of the same language and same placement that would normally be for a human person within this. And it received quite a bit of backlash. Even people that maybe had not heard of this at all were up in arms about it, so much so that Lattice then rolled it back, which then led to more discourse. So we'll get to the discourse, because I think this is fascinating. And really it's worth, I think, as much as I'm not a big fan of sort of both sidesism, I did find it interesting to see kind of what people's perspective was on this. This happened a couple of weeks ago during the UKG layoffs as well, where people were saying, if this makes long-term sense, is this okay? How do these decisions come about? And Rob Scott on LinkedIn thought that it was a reactionary move, saying that this is standing more or less, and Rob, feel free to put your own comments in either LinkedIn or on YouTube if I'm not correctly categorizing your argument, but more or less this is standing in the way of progress. We shouldn't let fear-based things happen. This is the wave of the future, and we shouldn't just be like, let our emotions handle this. I personally am all for sort of slowing things down and taking more consideration. Within that reaction piece, the term Luddite is used, which is often used for people that don't like technology, but that's not a good historical reading of the Luddites. What they really were was trying to get people thinking about the societal impacts. I think, my history isn't great here, but I think this was around the time of the Industrial Revolution and the looms and all that things that we always use as an example of going, people are working longer hours in these factories, and we're losing jobs and families and friendships and connections and all these sort of things that, sound pretty common to today's discourse as well and the conversations. So actually, I agree, though. We need to make a very slow and considerate movement and think strongly and observe the effect that these technologies can have on people and how we work. And is this going to cause job loss or a change in how we work? And are we not going to be connecting to people because they're going to be talking to AIs, and maybe some of the conversations that you were having with your son? Shout out to Cole Harris, by the way. I know his name. So
I thought you were going to be more impressed that I knew what an NCP player was. Okay. So here's the issue with this, right? I think that we have to be very, very cognizant of. One is, I've been saying for quite some time that we need to have some sort of oversight of these HR solutions, and particularly the AI HR solutions, because we need to be able to assess how the calibration of whether or not they are meeting even the basic standards of what we expect from human beings, let alone going above what we're expecting from human beings, right? Because we can make mistakes really fast with AI versus making mistakes kind of slower with employees. And so one of the things I've said is that we need to have something that does that in a way that is trackable, manageable. So I like where Lattice's head was at on this. I think, one, this was a bit of a marketing ploy, right? Like, even when I saw it come across my desk, I actually put it down and said, I don't even want to go there because I know what they're doing. It's a bit of a marketing ploy, right? And I know the Lattice team, we've had a couple conversations with them. I think they are trying to figure out where they fit in this market as a standalone point solution. They came out just about 2 weeks before that with the fact that they were going to have an HRMS, and that was a partnership and a relationship with Gusto, which is a little hard for me to wrap my head around because Gusto is primarily for very small SMB organizations. And Lattice generally, at least in our research, tends to have bigger organizations because they're more of a point solution and one of the top point solutions in the performance management space. So my sense is this feels a little bit all over the place for Lattice. That's, they're that old adage of no news or all news is good news. There's
no such thing as bad press or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I was
You're thinking of Gary Gnu, but yeah.
Yes. But I do think that we have to come up with a process for calibrating these AI technologies in a way that does not just assume that they are always right, but we don't want to stop the work and stop the innovation, because I do think that partnering them up and making the work with humans is going to be the power of this. But I think this is going to really get into, I actually thought that the timing on this was pretty terrible between this was launched, the UKG conversation was happening in the market, and then we had the SHRM conversation.
Oh my goodness. Please.
So at the same time, we have this idea of SHRM taking out the word equity from diversity, equity, and inclusion in their cataloging of what was diversity, equity, inclusion programs, tools, and they were flipping the conversation to be inclusion and diversity. And they just want to take equity out, and they felt equity was underneath the diversity conversation. I had a bigger and more visceral reaction to that conversation than I did to the Lattice piece. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's because for me, the equity conversation here is about not just, are we including people in our world, and are we making sure we have diverse workforces, but are we ensuring that everyone has equitable access, not just to pay, but to training, to opportunities, to being able to go overseas, to being able to do different projects. And I think equity is a piece that not only is it regulated in many cases, but it's not something we can just sort of gloss over. And this exact conversation is because of that, right? An AI bot, if we can't get equity for females and for people of color in our work environment, are we at that point where we're going to step in and say we're going to compare a workforce to AI? So I think it's just very tone deaf in sort of how it was being viewed. But I do think that there is a place for the conversation. I don't disagree with the comments that were made both by Rob as well as Thomas Otter and a couple others who were on there. But I also think many of them who were making those comments have never been in a situation where they have been maybe in an environment where they are the person in the room who's different, right? And that's a very hard place to be. And then you start throwing things like technology on top of those conversations and how we use technology and how technology is being thought of. And it doesn't feel very inclusive in how we're thinking about it, but it definitely doesn't feel very equitable in some cases. So that's my 2 cents on that. I think there's a lot more to be said. I'll put some comments on Rob's outreach. He actually called me out on it, and I'm going to do that this evening. But I just think it's a good conversation to have. I think we've got to remember that, we need to watch these tools and we need to have a human conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And exactly, and have the conversation rather than just sort of a reaction, right? Which I think most people would agree with on that. This concept, though, of this idea of these AI tools and how sort of ubiquitous they become and that they're really getting into the larger press, I think was really hammered home by some research that was done. AIM put out some research on just how many different AI officers there are. So much so that they will say, hey, look at some of the top AI officers, right? We went from within the space of less than 10 years, right? I would say, of AI being something that was like, keep an eye on it. This is this new tech. Do we literally have AI officers at some of the largest companies? And some are where you would expect. Sure, NASA makes sense. You've got an AI officer, Analog Devices, Boston shout out. Great to see that too. But then, Workday was on that list. Accenture's on that list. These companies that are leading the way in terms of AI officers that are very firmly within our space, of HR. And because this is where the biggest impact is being felt, right, is in our people duties. So it was really interesting to see that there, and that just making think about how big of a thing it is, AI. And so I think it's well worth having that conversation of how are we going to treat this? How are we going to use it? Because it simply isn't something that can be ignored or it'll work itself out. That is not happening.
Well, and I think that's the exact thing there. The thing that got me on this one is, do we need to start including in our assessment of companies, especially the technology and even the consulting services that we get from companies, whether or not they have someone who is overseeing these things? I know now from a technology perspective, we definitely look to see if you have a chief technology officer. You wouldn't expect to not have a chief technology officer in an organization, right? You would not expect to have maybe this chief cyber officer inside of an organization if you're dealing with data privacy and standards and your content being sort of moved around. I think we're going to get to a point where you kind of have to have, do I have a chief AI officer or many of them I saw were a combination of chief AI and data, which I kind of like that. I think that's definitely a connection. I don't know where this is going to go, but I do think it's one of those hallmarks of looking at your technology companies. I always look at it the same way. Does the technology company have a chief people officer? Do you have someone who's head of HR in the HR technology environment? A lot of times we would see someone who'd say, well, they're head of HR and they're head of the product. And I always say that's a really bad sign, right? It's like, well, they're customer zero and they're guiding our product. Like, no.
Right. It's like
you need
engineering and sales.
Who's focused here. Yeah. So to me, that was a good sign. I like kind of seeing this is a list like any other list, right, that comes out. But I just like the conversation about, do we have someone who has oversight here, right?
Yeah. It's really interesting. And, I wanted to wrap it up because we've been talking about all these kind of new and interesting things going on. And I think my comment just now is this isn't something that's just going to work itself out. But that doesn't mean it's the only perspective out there. Nita Lennox had a great post on LinkedIn that, as always, we'll have that shared. That is the AI bubble ready to burst? And linking to and this isn't just speculation, just links to some stories from all over. Goldman Sachs saying that they're not seeing a return on their investment. Sequoia as well, saying basically the same thing. A few people that are sort of reaching that, there's a new technology sort of curve, right? Where it's like, it's very up and then it's like that trough of disappointment. I think there's a term for that before it sort of evens out, where we sort of overbelieve and then under, and then it kind of finds its way. That to me seems more likely than a bubble. I think a traditional bubble, when it bursts, it goes away, right? The housing market was very much a bubble. These prices were just blown out until there was just nobody left. It was wiped out and is only recovering now. Well, it might be another bubble again, but we won't go into the housing. But, and these are the companies that are responsible for putting the money in, as we kind of talked about at the beginning. And if they're the ones saying we're not quite seeing that yet, then we may see a big slowdown on this. Something that we have talked about quite a lot on this show is that these organizations are putting, all of these AI capabilities in, but it is not cheap to do this. This is expensive hardware, software. It's expensive to develop. It's expensive to maintain. it's being put in because they're expecting to make that money back at some point. This is the way of the world. And so if it seemed like maybe this isn't the way, then we are going to see probably some pullback. We won't try and put AI infuse everything. And honestly, I don't know if that's bad, but I think it's us that should decide, right? The users. We need to be very vocal about what do we really need? What is its impact going to be? And what do we not need? What is best done with a human? Something that probably sounds like a broken record for me at this point.
Well, and I think the one that caught my eye on this, I mean, it seems to be this episode, we're pulling a lot from LinkedIn. That happens sometimes, right? Because I think the conversations, when I talk about spilling the tea on HR tech, sometimes I'm like, it's not just that someone did this or something that it's also the interesting conversations interplaying between it. So I like to see when these, we get a chance to sort of delve into some of these deeper conversations. Anything that really caught my eye, I'm not sure of the amount because I'd have to go back and actually look at it, but Anita had the called out, Goldman Sachs reports that despite, I think that's 1 trillion, but I'm sure that's not. It's probably some number that I just, some association of dollar that I don't have right. But it was a really big investment number here, and there's little to show from it, right? Like, was their comment, but they still hope for the killer app. Like that was the line that caught my eye. Is that it definitely early days of cloud when people were like, oh, cloud, not everything's going to move to the cloud.
Right.
I think we can really honestly say that this is not a bubble. AI is the comment we hear over and over again is, this is the worst AI you're ever going to use because it's only going to get better from here, right? I think the big conversation for us is, where does your AI get trained? How do you think practically about the use of AI? It was the same conversation we had last time we talked, which is about, what do you really want AI to do for you? And that's what I'm excited about seeing, because I am seeing in our research this year already some really practical uses of AI from the HR professionals. So when we get a chance to sort of synthesize our data, I think you guys are going to get really excited. You're going to see, we're going to have some insights around companies and how they're using AI that's going to be different from what I think we're all thinking right now, which is, the chatbot and the chat GPT and the analysis of some word stuff. These HR professionals who have sort of gone down this path practically and have invested money, and it will be a bigger number than it was last year, have done it very carefully. And that's what I'm so proud of, is I think the HR community has been leading in this space more than we give them credit for. And to me, that's the story here, is that let's sort of sidestep some of the excitement over the craziness of AI. And let's look at those HR leaders and those HR professionals who have taken this and figured out a way to make it work with humans and create an environment that is basically positive for everybody, right? There's nobody, work's not always great, but I do think, none of us like to do some of the granular stuff we have to do every day just to get through our jobs. And I think that's the real win we have here. So I would say practicality, know where your money's being spent, understand what you're trying to get out of it, right? Just like any other application that you have in your organization, right?
Well said. Couldn't have said it better. And I'm very excited, as you mentioned very early on the beginning of the show and just now, about the sort of data that we're going in and we're going into it. You had said early on that we kind of knew that there was going to be a lot of M&A activity. And the reason why is because we had the data, that we could see what was happening. We look at HR, but we're looking not just at tech, but at, the finance side of it too. And it's been really cool. I feel like I get a crystal ball. This is the time of year, listeners and viewers, that, we've got the data in and we're looking at it and going, oh, I did not expect that, or, oh, this is interesting. I now get to sound like the smartest person on the planet. But you can too, because obviously that is going to be for sale soon. Little shameless promotion, but I figure it's okay because it's our own company, your own company, and I'm very excited. And it's, by the next time you hear from us, I think we'll have a true exact number of the number of participants, but I know for sure it's higher than ever by a country miles, they say down here. And thank you so much to all of you that took it. I know we are kind of hounding you on this show, and please, strongly pleading to you to take it. And so many of you heard that call and responded. And because of that, we're able to now give you back very accurate data and make better predictions and continue to be right, but with even more certainty And we'll be able to talk about all those things that Stacey just said, of like what companies are doing and what you should probably think about next, long before there's another housing bubble or something like that.
Yeah, the data is always Cliff's getting a chance. This is the first year it was always overwhelming because you're just scared. There's just so much. But the second year is when you really get a chance to like, oh, I know this, and now I understand the survey and the questions. And so this is the first year he's getting. I had this for about 10 years now to really just the wow of the research and the data that we do in this front. Just for anybody who didn't get a chance to participate, I just want to reiterate, you will have an opportunity to both see some early key findings if you join us at the HR Technology Conference. We have a 1 p.m. session on the first day of the HR Technology Conference, as well as we'll be doing an Ask the Expert the following day. So if you want to get more details and more information, also we will have some special pricing on this as Cliff had mentioned. We're bundling together kind of last year's and this year's data. So if you're keeping an eye out for that will be probably out in the next couple of weeks once we launch that. We don't have any updates on where we'll be at right now. I do know August is going to get kind of quiet because we're going to be in the process of writing and putting the data down. We do know in September that we'll be at a few events. I think we're going to be at Oracle Cloud World. Correct, Cliff? You'll be there, right?
That'll be the second week of September. Won't know the exact dates, but feel free to reach out to us through the normal channels. You can write to us directly when you see the show on LinkedIn, or you can reach me at cliff@sapientinsights.com.
Yeah, and Susan Richards, who is our founder, will be at Workday's annual event, Workday Rising, right before the HR Technology Conference in Las Vegas. And then we'll obviously be at the HR Technology Conference, as I mentioned. And then after that, we'll be at the iSolved Conference, the UKG Conference, and I think the Workday European Conference. So our dance cards are getting filled up. If you know of an event you want us to attend and it fits into sort of the things that we're doing, please be sure to reach out earlier rather than later. But if you are someone who just wants to connect with us, please let us know. We are happy to connect with you at any of these events. I know we're kind of wrapping up today. The only other things I just wanted to remind the audience of is that if you like what you're seeing here, both in our now on video, which has been really hard for me and Cliff to get transitioned into, as well as in our podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe. That's really important. Those numbers help us, help everyone out, and make sure that this keeps running and going. Also, go to our website if you want to know more details to sign up for our newsletter to get ongoing updates on research launches, where we'll be speaking, all those kind of things, so you can get the actual dates. And then when the next survey data will be up and out. Be sure to listen to our sister HR Huddle podcast, HR We Have a Problem, hosted by our CEO, Terry Zipper. And then also to stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and get all the behind the scenes content, you can follow us at Sapient Insights on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. Almost every event that we go to, Cliff and I will be putting LinkedIn posts on what we're hearing and what we're seeing, just to share that with everyone. Cliff, once again, thanks for pulling all this together. I know we've been kind of off and on today trying to get this recorded, but it's really important topics. I think we hear every week from everyone saying that the conversations make a difference. We love having the conversations here. Thanks to our production team, Brand Method Media Group, including their amazing founder, Kelly. She does some great work if you want to check out some of her podcast and marketing efforts. Our marketing team, Lisa Renko and Summer Orlena, they make sure everything gets done and everything gets out. And most importantly, thanks to the listeners here in the community. We couldn't do this without you. You guys make the difference. That's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea in HR Tech, Cliff. We hope it's been just the brew everyone needed to start the engines running this week. We'll be back in just 2 weeks with another pot of boiling hot HR tech updates and insights. Thanks, everyone.